Welcome to episode 25 of Full Momentum and HEC-RAS podcast. I'm your host, Ben Carey. Here joining me as always is Chris Goodell, and we have a very exciting guest for today's episode. This is going to be an episode, we've done these in the past where we bring on an expert in river mechanics and hydraulics, and this is going to be our latest episode involving that. So please welcome Stanford Gibson to the podcast. Stanford is the sediment transport specialist at HEC and also the host of the very popular RSM River Mechanics podcast. Stan, welcome.
Hey, it's great to be here, guys.
Hey, Stanford, nice to see you.
You too,
Good to see you in your office there, looking very busy and having fun.
Yeah.
So, Stanford, I got to ask you off the top, have you listened to any episodes of the Full Momentum podcast?
I have listened to Full Momentum. I got introduced to it when you had Gary Bruner, who was my boss and mentor for a number of years. But then I kind of went down the rabbit hole, and you've got some good episodes, some good stuff.
So how did Gary do? Be truthful. Be honest. We won't tell him about this podcast, so you can be honest.
Gary did great. Yeah.
No, he's awesome. He does great. He's got his wealth of information, and it's always great to find out the latest and greatest with RAS through Gary. So
yeah, and he always has it. He always has it right there to share too. You don't have to prompt him very much to get lots of good content.
That is true. Yeah. Well, Stan, it's awesome having you on. I've been a big time admirer of you and the work you do and the presentations you give. And now you're getting into podcasting, which is awesome. And I hope everyone who's listening to this will be able to check out your podcast, which we'll talk a lot about throughout this one. But it's been great seeing the work you've done. You've been at HEC for how long now?
Oh my goodness. Well, when did you move to Portland? because I
2003. Yeah. So we overlapped a little bit there, right?
We did.
About 2 years, I think. And
right, but then I filled the position that you vacated, and
I
like to say that your family are the most important people in my career.
Well, hey man, that's really nice of you to say, but what I like to say, I may have said this on the podcast before. I'm sure I told you this, Stanford, but my greatest gift to HEC was leaving so you could take the role and take it to astronomical levels, places I never would have been able to take it to. So that's my gift to HEC, and I guess to you too and your family, Stanford.
Well, that's too kind, but I've been here about 20 years now, and I've been the sediment lead for most of that, like 18, 19.
Yeah, what were you doing before I left and we overlapped? Where were you at HEC? What were you working on?
I just wanted to get my foot in the door. I knew HEC was the place I wanted to be, and they had an opening in the economics section. And so I was working on like flood risk and economics, but I had my eye on the RAS team and was able to move over pretty quickly.
But that's a great bit of time and background experience to get. I would think. I don't know. What do you think? To have a little economics and risk and that kind of thing, because that's where we're kind of moving in this field, right?
That's right. And so I got introduced to all the Monte Carlo stuff before it was cool, and the hydraulics, and economists think about the world a lot like ecologists, which is a lot closer to sediment transport because it is so uncertain. And so I really feel like it was a great background, and it's great to understand how downstream users will use RAS and how RAS works into the economic models, and you can actually make decisions based on hydraulics.
Very cool. Yeah. So Stan, a quick question for you. Do you want to tell the listeners a little bit about your background, maybe where you went to school, what you studied, and how that maybe informed your decision to get into sediment transport analysis and modeling?
Sure. Yeah, I went to undergrad at the State University of New York at Geneseo, which is actually one of the top SUNY schools, but it's small. It's like 4,000 people, and no one's heard of it. But it's a little liberal arts school. It had no engineering program, and that was by design because I applied to undergrads as an art major. And so I ended up at this undergrad that had no engineering program, and figured out pretty quickly that what I wanted to do was applied science. And so the most technical degree I could get at Geneseo, which was a great school and had a girl that I was interested in there, so I was not leaving, was geophysics. So I got a geophysics degree with a math minor, and I just love geophysics. And I was interested in like the applied sciences and how to use mathematics to simulate the natural world, but not just like from a pure science, but from an actual like how does this help infrastructure and ecosystems and just human lives. And so I went to grad school for engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then I got my first job at the Buffalo district of the Corps of Engineers. It was kind of a tough time to get a job, and turns out that if you want to get an entry-level job in Colorado, good luck. But if you want to get a pretty nice job in Buffalo, New York, it's not that competitive. And so it was a great place to start. We grew up in that area, and so I showed up to the Buffalo district. And they had me doing flood insurance studies, which is what you give a 20-year-old when they come to do hydraulic work. And then the sediment specialist at the Buffalo district, she was older, and her husband got ill, and they kind of reevaluated their life a little bit. And she just came in one day and she said, "We're going to sail around the world. We'll see you in a year."
Oh my God.
She walked out.
Wow.
And then, so my boss went over, and incidentally, great decision. I really respect it. But my boss walked over and picked up the work from her desk. And this was back when you actually picked up work, when it was like physical stuff. He picked up the pile of work from her desk, walked over to my desk, dropped it on my desk and said, "Well, you have a geology background. You're our new sediment specialist." And and so then the sediment specialist came back and said, "Hey, that was fun. We're going to do it again." And so I just kind of became the sediment specialist at the Buffalo district, and found it was much more interesting than running flood insurance studies.
Yeah. So Stanford, I've got to back up here. Okay. You said something that really piqued my interest, and that is that you went to school to be an art major.
Buried the lead.
You skipped by that really quick. And I hope that you're okay talking about this. But what was your specialty? What kind of art did you like, and what did you want to do?
My specialty was bad art. So my wife thinks it's hilarious that I went to school as an art major, because she knew me in high school, and she's like, "You weren't very, good artists have a hard time making a living. You weren't a good artist. I wouldn't have married you." But I applied to school as an art major, but I took calculus my senior year of high school and realized that calculus is art. And I decided at that point, even though I had applied as an art major, I went in and I took math. I kind of started as math. And the more math I did, I thought it was cool, but I also wanted to like interact with the physical world. So that's kind of when I got into physics and then geophysics. And I really like Caravaggio. Caravaggio is my favorite artist, but I can't. My kids do much better art than I do these days.
Okay, so in my experience, in this world, we have mostly left brain or right brain people. And especially in the engineering world, we're all left brain, right? But you might be one of the few who's got a little bit of both, right? A little creativity you've got that art background. And so I want to ask you is, sediment transport, well, I should back up. Hydraulic modeling, there's a lot of art into it. Setting up a model, building a model, representing the real world in a simulation.
That's right.
I would say even more so in sediment transport modeling. Yes. Have you found that your art background has been helpful?
Well, my art background has nothing to do with it, because it's hardly background. I doodled in high school. But I would say that sediment modeling in particular is a craft. It's not a discipline. And one of the things I like to talk about is, if you're going to become a sediment transport modeler, or even a hydraulic modeler, or a hydrologic modeler, any of these multi-parameter models, it's not like we went to school for structural engineering and now we have a cookbook and we grind through it. This is an art. It's a craft. And the way that people learn crafts is not through education. It's through apprenticeship. And so one of the things we've been trying to do in the Corps is build capacity, not necessarily through classes. I teach classes, but through apprenticeship. And so I think that's the main thing in which it matters, that, modeling is a craft rather than, just a discipline.
Would you say that the podcast that you're doing, the RSM River Mechanics podcast, is part of that desire.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. Because I think that a lot of the things that I've learned about river mechanics, sediment transport, and fluvial geomorphology have come not from books or classes, but from being in the field with mentors and just asking as many questions, even just watching where their eyes are going and asking them, what are you looking at?
Yeah.
And so most of us won't get the chance to be in the field with these people. I've been pretty lucky. And so I'm trying to get that to scale a little bit, just to have the conversations with these subject matter experts.
Yeah, and you can't do that in a classroom. I mean, classroom's great. It's great to throw information at people and the how-tos, but yeah, that little bit of mentorship is huge.
I wonder too if we talk about we were talking about earlier how sediment transport and kind of that embraces uncertainty a lot better than a lot of other fields of engineering. And so I wonder if that inclination that you might have towards being a little bit right-brained kind of helps you in that way. Because I know a lot of civil engineers struggle with uncertainty. We're very black and white thinkers. And so I wonder if there's anything to that as well.
That's actually turns out to be, as I look back on all the conversations of the podcast, it turns out to be one of the themes. You know, a couple of people have told me that a lot of engineers don't last long in hydraulic modeling or especially sediment transport because they're engineers and they want an answer. And, you know, basically modeling reduces the risk of a decision, but it reduces the risk. You still bear some of that risk. And so to be in you have to be able to, you have to be comfortable with a situation that is fundamentally uncertain, where you're going to make the best possible decision, but there is still a substantial chance that you'll be wrong.
It's a little bit terrifying the first time you realize that the answers you're giving are wrong.
That's right.
All your answers are wrong. They can be useful and can help you make decisions, but they're not the right answer, even with the best hydraulic or sediment transport model out there. So Stanford, when you came to HEC decades and decades ago, you we overlapped a couple of years, and then when I left, you took the sediment transport position and just went crazy with it. But in the meantime, you kept studying. You kept going to school. UC Davis. Was it all UC Davis?
No, I haven't.
No. Okay. So just give us a quick rundown of all of the academic pursuits you've had since coming to HEC and what you have out of that. Yeah.
I have to preface this with, I don't recommend this for anyone. This is a little bit of a personality disorder. My mom was a first generation immigrant. And one of the things you see in like second generation immigrants is that they tend to have a certain amount of, they tend to be very academic in ways that aren't super helpful. You know, my parents were both teachers, and so school was really important in my house. And so if there was more school available to me, I did it. With all that said, yeah, I have a PhD and 3 master's degrees. The PhD is from Davis in engineering. One of the master's degrees I mentioned, it's from the University of Wisconsin in geotech. But then I went back after my PhD to get a master's degree in ecology, because a lot of the sediment transport work we're doing is restoration work. And I realized I needed to be able to talk to ecologists. And actually, ecologists think about the world in a more helpful way for an uncertain processes like geomorphology and sediment transport. We're more like ecologists than we are like hydraulic engineers or structural engineers. And then I have one more in there that's weird. I do have a theology degree from Wheaton Graduate School.
Oh, very cool.
Wow. Yeah. So you've been very busy with schoolwork throughout your career, but you have a family too. And I know that your daughters are into soccer and you coach soccer. How did you juggle all of that? How did you do work full time, be a family man, and get these masters and a PhD?
He didn't sleep.
Well, no. You know, most of the degree, you know, my wife and I got married early. We were married at 22, but we didn't have kids until we were more than 30. And so most of that I did in my 20s. I would say that, you know, use your 20s. Your 20s are when you build what you're going to use for the rest of your life. And the other thing is that I think that most people are whatever they do between the hours of 6 and 8. Those are the bonus hours. And so I usually write from 6 to 8 in the morning. And so whatever, I get like that is the most productive time. And so those are, maybe that's the extra time, but I don't know. I never know how to answer that question.
Well, it's impressive. It's impressive. When I went to graduate school, I was fortunate enough that I could go full time, take a break from work.
Yeah.
And so I could focus on that. And that was hard enough for me. I can't imagine working full time. I know a lot of people do it, and it's very impressive.
Well, UC Davis is 2 blocks from my work. So 2 of those degrees,
That's true.
I would just come in early. I'd bike to class.
Yep.
I'd stay late.
Yeah,
So
very cool.
Dan, I want to go back to that handoff transition period at HEC between yourself and Chris, because one of the things that Chris likes to say he contributed to the HEC-RAS engine that we all use is the sediment transport button in the design of that.
No. Let's clarify. It wasn't the sediment transport, because I think that's yours, Stan, right? Because I've seen that on your icon.
But the hydraulic design button.
The hydraulic design button is the one that and that's maybe one of my proudest moments in life.
And incidentally,
hey, I've got a button.
Last week, we just taught a combined class. John Shelley from the Kansas City District and we have a whole class, a 2.5-day class just on the hydraulic design features, which are calculators, sediment calculators in RAS. A lot of them Chris developed that allow you to do screening level analysis if you don't have time or budget for a full sediment transport model. And we just think these are really cool. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but this, we have a whole class on this. So we spent a lot of time in the things that you contributed, Chris.
Well, I'm glad it's still hanging on and still living inside of RAS. I have to admit, I hardly ever use them. I use that uniform flow thing every once in a while. But now with full sediment transport in RAS, I don't know if I've ever gone back to the sediment transport capacity feature in there, but I suppose, for something quick might be useful.
So for restoration studies in particular, they just don't have the budget for a sediment transport model, but they still should be doing failure mode analysis for morphological failure modes. And those tools, particularly the Copeland tool and the attractive force tool, those are excellent. And then we've added a few more tools in there that are going to be really helpful.
Very cool. Great. So we're going to be able to get into your podcast that you run here, Stan, but I also know that you do a lot of teaching and presentations along with the podcast itself. So it seems like, speaking and engaging with the H&H and sediment transport community at large is a strength of yours. How did you learn the skills that you have when it comes to teaching, presenting, hosting podcasts, all that? Where does that come from? If somebody's interested in doing something similar to that, what would be some recommendations that you might give them?
I didn't realize how much speaking and writing would be a part of a technical field, right? No one ever told me that. I never took those classes. And I realized pretty quickly that if you can't communicate what you've done, you haven't really done it. Like, no one cares. And so it became pretty clear that I needed to be able to speak and to write. And this is also kind of connected with my new obsession with like web video and podcasts, is that there's a whole generation that actually doesn't care what you write. They care about what's on YouTube and maybe some long form audio. And so I'm kind of obsessed with the communication of very difficult principles. My field is pretty opaque. It's pretty confusing. And to be able to communicate that clearly was really important to me. And so I just kind of became a student of public speaking. And I don't think I'm a great public speaker. Maybe relative to other engineers, I do okay. But I think that there's just a few things. There's a few principles that I think people overlook. And the first is, you just got to practice. I think that we're not, no one tells us, you have to practice your talk, but I'm giving a talk tonight. It's a talk I've given several times. I'm going to practice it twice before I go there. And I think a lot of people are kind of against practicing talks because it'll feel stilted, but I'd rather have it be clear and feel a little stilted than have it wander and kind of not hit the point. And then I actually listened to this was back before podcasts were podcasts. You could like download MP3s and actually listen to a lot of content by kind of two kind of disparate but interesting communities, pastors and comedians. Pastors and comedians give a lot of thought to, audible narrative. And so these are two communities that actually have a lot of content about how to present well and in a meaning and compelling way. And so I kind of studied those fields and what they were saying. And then, the more storytelling you can do, the better it is. You have to break up technical content with storytelling. But then I think the one thing that I tell people is that, you have to be genuinely interested. If you don't believe that what you're saying matters, then the people who are listening to you aren't going to think it matters. And so I try not to give talks on anything I don't think matters.
Yeah, I can definitely see the comedic influence in your presentations, and this is I mean this in the best possible way. But when I see you give presentations, Stan, probably almost more than any other, certainly any technical presentation, I find myself chuckling just nonstop, because you throw in these little statements here and there that just add a little flavor to what you're talking about. And I don't know, it's hard to describe, but it's very entertaining when you present. It's very fun and very dynamic, and there's definitely some comedy in there, and it's a lot of fun. So
well, here's the technical secret behind that, is that I don't write jokes. I don't have the ability to write jokes. I speak jokes. And so anything that's funny about any of my presentations came during the practice. And so while I'm practicing, I'll say something funny, and then I'll just I'll make a note of it and it'll happen. Or I'll say something that I think is funny, but it's actually either inappropriate or really not that funny. And I won't do it next time. I won't do it in front of the crowd. And so actually I think that the practice is where, at least in my process, where the comedy comes in.
Yeah, it's funny when you give presentations over and over again, you get to that spot where that joke that you've told before is coming up. And I always have the toughest time saying a joke, even with a brand new audience who's never heard it before, to bring that joke up again. I feel like I'm telling a joke to somebody who I've already told it to like 5 minutes ago. And it's really awkward feeling. I don't know. Do you ever get that?
No, if I
you can tell them over and over.
If I'm coming up to because one of the things in my presentation framework is you shouldn't go more than 4 minutes without some sort of attention reset. It used to be 7 minutes because our attention reset was set to sitcoms, but now with YouTube videos, the attention reset is more like 4 minutes. And so I'm going to try to do something to get the audience back every 4 minutes. And so that means I'm either going to do some sort of visual gag, or I'm going to tell a story, or I'm going to tell a joke. And so if I kind of see the audience waning, then, and I know I have a joke that I've told before coming up, I'm just waiting for it. Because it's a gift to them. It's a gift to the audience to kind of bring them in and help them re-engage with difficult material.
Yeah, and that's really important when you're presenting on or discussing material as complex and dense. Some people might say dense as sediment transport.
I talk about river dirt for a living. People don't believe that's a job. And so if I can't make it interesting, no one's gonna care.
Yeah.
I just really quick, Chris, I was gonna just build off something Stan said about taking kind of complex topics and making them very easy to digest. And that just reminded me of the episode that we did with Grady Hillhouse in practical engineering. And I think there's a lot of parallels between what you're trying to do with river mechanics and what Grady's trying to do. Well, I mean, a lot of similarities, right? I mean, Grady, is at a whole nother level from Chris and I and from yourself. But still, I think that the motivation of putting content like this together with that in mind is a great thing. So I applaud you for doing that. I think it's a gift to folks that are out there that are maybe interested in river mechanics, hydraulic engineering, but even maybe more importantly, folks that didn't even know that was a field, right? And didn't know you could study river dirt for a living, because a lot of civil engineering is underappreciated and misunderstood within the greater societal context. And so I think anytime that we can produce this type of content, get it out there, make people realize that this is a real thing and that it's really cool, I think that's awesome.
That's cool.
So Stanford, let's get into the podcast you're doing.
Sure.
So it's called the RSM River Mechanics Podcast. You're the host, and you interview legends in the field. I mean, I'm talking about like these are guys that I never dreamed I'd ever meet when I started out. And I was following their work and looking at all the cool stuff that they've done over their careers, using their methods, and you get to sit down with them and talk to them. So tell me, how did this whole thing come about, number one, and what's the idea? What are you trying to do with this podcast?
Well, I already mentioned to you, I feel like I'm a kind of a podcast hipster. Like I was into podcasts before they were cool. And so I've always found long form audio to be a good way to build understanding. And I like the conversation form of long form audio because it decreases the cognitive load. You're not listening to one person kind of drone on. The banter of conversation makes it more accessible. And so I just think long form audio, I think podcasts, there's a reason that there's a podcast boom. It's because it's awesome. And and so every morning, one of the things I did during COVID is I finally got a daily morning run. So I go running every morning. And it's a practice I want to keep. And so I have these podcasts that I listen to that I look forward to enough to drag myself out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
And I listen to all sorts of cool podcasts about lots of different fields. And I've always just been like, well, that's cool. I'm learning a lot about economics and psychology and philosophy. What about my field? Where's the podcast on my field? Where are the great interviews with the legends of my field? And so for years, I've been talking to my wife about, man, I'd love to do a podcast. I wish someone would do a podcast. And that eventually turned into, I'd love to do a podcast. And she said, that sounds great, but you need to find someone who's going to fund it, or you have to wait till the kids are out of the house. And I said, yeah, you're absolutely right. Because I knew it would become an obsession. And so then the Regional Sediment Management Program in the Corps of Engineers, I gave them a proposal, and they provided a little bit of funding to get this off the ground, enough for me to like travel places and hire an editor and have these conversations. And the idea is that there's kind of a demographic gap in federal service. There are like 6 Generation Xers in federal service because of the Clinton-Reagan years. There wasn't a lot of hiring. And so there's a bunch of boomers that are retiring. And then there's a bunch of millennials and Gen Zs, which I'm sorry, we call you Gen Zs. We were called Gen X. It was an injustice. We just need a better name for that generation. But they're the ones that are coming into federal service. And people are kind of looking at this like thin layer of Xers to be the new subject matter experts. And there's not enough of us. And so one of the things that I really want to do, and I also really believe in legacy. I just believe, I want everyone to know the tradition in which they're connected to. And so what I really want to do is introduce young practitioners to the people who mentored me, to the people who really mattered to who I became, and not kind of just through me, but to actually have some access to their wisdom and their insight in a form, in a technological form that will be accessible to them.
Yeah, I really like that idea too of giving people a face or the sound of their voice as opposed to just a name on a paper, right? That person published, or a reference that person's listed on. I've read a lot of different reference material out there on the hydraulic end of things. And I'm sure I would recognize the last name, but when you connect it with the face or the sound of somebody's voice, it's just a whole different level of connection. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I think Stanford, you just put out episode 5, I want to say, with Chris Nygaard, right? And even with just the 5 episodes, I've gotten a lot of yard work done on your podcasts. I just have to tell you, a lot of lawn mowing, a lot of tree pruning. Yeah. So it's a great way to kind of lose yourself in a monotonous task with some knowledge coming in, while you're doing it. So great kind of multitasking thing, which we don't get to do too often.
And I work for a federal agency, and federal agencies are great. I love working for a federal agency, but one of the things that federal agencies aren't known for is efficiency. And so there are some times when we're waiting in line for a CAT card, or just like at some office there's downtime in the workday sometimes to multitask if it's audio. You can't be watching videos. It's hard to read papers, but you have an earbud in your ear, you can actually like make some ground.
Yeah. What's your favorite non-technical podcast that you listen to? Your guilty pleasure of podcasts?
Oh no.
To put you on the spot.
I like conversations with Tyler. He's an economist, and
Okay.
one of the things I like about him, and he's actually influenced me a lot, is he tries to read everything the person has written, and so he has. I think that his podcast, he asks the best questions because he knows their stuff, and he has a section in the middle that I really like that's called Underrated Overrated, where they just do like quick questions, and the guest is on the seat to say whether the thing is overrated or underrated. I think that's really fun.
That's awesome. Chris, I don't know if I've ever asked you, do you have a favorite podcast that's not technical related?
It varies throughout the year. A lot of it has to do with sports. And well, my favorite technical one now, of course, is Stanford's RSM River Mechanics. But I listen to some college baseball podcasts. In fact, it's funny, I was teaching a class in Houston, and one of the attendees of the class, her husband does a college baseball podcast, and I started listening to that, and that was a lot of fun. Let's see, what else do I listen to? I'll tune into Joe Rogan occasionally. He's kind of funny, brings in some interesting guests. There's going to be Dead Air, I think, a good one. But, anything, I'll tune into different sports things. Like in college football season, I'll try to find a college football. Pac-12, there's a Pac-12 podcast I listen to occasionally. So how about you, Ben?
Yeah, I'm a hardcore history with Dan Carlin.
Oh yeah, that's another one I like. Yeah,
that's the exception to my rule of conversation is better, is because he can just monologue and like no one else.
Oh my gosh, it's fantastic. Yeah. But like you said, I mean that's not something that we would probably advise anybody who's starting a podcast to take that form, because you do have to have a special cadence and a special voice and a special level of interest and passion that really Dan only has. So shouts to you, Dan.
Oh yeah, I do have a guilty pleasure one, which is, it's kind of just a knucklehead podcast, but it's a good time waster. Smartless, if you guys have ever seen that one or heard that one. I mean, so it's just these three celebrity guys who interview other celebrities, and it could be anything. It's kind of fun. But
cool. So a follow up on the RSM podcast, Stan, to kind of switch back to the main topic today. What do you see? Where do you see the podcast going? Do you just see kind of continuing to do what you're doing now, connecting with individuals, having conversations? Is there something in the future, either podcast specific, or even maybe ways that you want to see the series evolve over time?
Well, some of it's contingent on funding.
Sure, fair.
But there will be a second season, whether I get funded or not, because I've got enough episodes now that there will be a second season. And one of the things the second season is going to do is right now, the first season has really been Corps of Engineers and USGS, subject matter experts from those two federal agencies. But in the second season, I'm starting to talk to more academics and people who have done the like, we do applied research in the agencies, but like the fundamental research. And so we're talking to more of them. And then I have a friend named Jim Selgin from the Detroit district, and we want to do a series called Classic Papers with Jim. And the idea here is, I don't know if another podcast I listen to will like redo historic football drafts, or they'll do like movie drafts from a year where they'll take turns picking their favorite movies from that year. We want to do a historic fluvial geomorph paper draft where we draft the classic papers in fluvial geomorph, and so we're just going to have some short, it's hopefully going to be a series of shorts where we're going to have short conversations about some of the classic papers to just kind of inculcate. There's a statistics podcast I listen to, and it's above my head, but every once in a while he brings his wife on, and they do a 15-minute episode where he has to explain to his wife a principle of data science, and she'll like hold him to like using language that she'll understand. And so I listen to all of those because it's a pretty good introduction to the field. And so I'd like to do a series of, shorts where someone who's kind of new to geomorphology or river mechanics or sediment transport could have an accessible way in.
Yeah. Wow. That's just some awesome ideas. So it sounds like you got a lot planned or maybe preliminarily planned, at least for now.
Yeah. And we're going to do some live episodes at the SEDHIDE conference as well.
Oh, cool.
And so there's going to be a season 2.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we had a lot of positive feedback with doing the podcast at the ASFPM conference last year. So yeah. Cool.
And that was a lot of fun. I mean, it's a blast when you have just people coming up and they're like, look at what's going on over there. And what are you guys talking about? And then they want to get in on it. And so it's a lot of fun. But hey, we have a thing we started with Gary called RAS Trivia. Yes. And we'd like to play it with you, Stanford, if you're game.
Right. I'll try.
And so here's how it works. So we each have a couple questions and we try to stump the other two, and we'll just kind of do round robin format. So,
and just, I do want to just caveat again, because I had to let everyone know this when it was Chris and Gary and I'm at a distinct disadvantage here, given that I wasn't part of the team that designed the original HEC-RAS software. But, I just got to caveat that a little bit.
And I kept that in mind, Ben. So the questions I have, well, at least one of them, you can certainly make a guess on.
Okay.
So let me,
well,
I'll go.
Mine is much easier.
Okay, I'll go first, and then we'll go to Stan, and then to you, Ben, and we'll go around. So, okay, so my first question, it's actually a kind of a two-parter here. What was the year and the project that Tony Thomas worked on that led to the development of HEC-6, HEC-6?
Well,
so for those of you who don't
Tony.
know, for those of you out in listening world that you don't know, HEC-6 is the legacy precursor to sediment transport in HEC-RAS, and it was a DOS-based kind of a text file input-output style program that was pretty much the number one industry tool for this kind of stuff before RAS took over sediment. So, year and the project that Tony Thomas worked on that led to the development of HEC-6.
Well, let me go first because I have a much lower percentage chance of getting this right. So I will throw out a guess and say 1989.
Okay.
That is a complete guess.
Okay.
So I knew the answer to the project, but I did just interview Tony for season 2. Tony Thomas is my mentor. I was an HEC-6 user. He helped us get sediment transport into RAS. And so I've known it was the Arkansas River. And he tells a great story about that in the podcast. The reason I was in Arkansas is because we're actually doing new work on the Arkansas River. The year he told me, I'm going to forget, but I do have a point of reference. I got an email from the Omaha district a couple of months ago, and they had a picture of a box, and they showed it to. They said, "You want this?" And I was like, "What is it?" And it was videotapes of Tony Thomas teaching the first HEC-6 class in the Omaha district in 1976. So I know it's before 1976.
Oh, wow, okay.
I was born in 75. And so Tony, I think was starting to work on it in the late 60s. I would say then he came to HEC around 73. So I would say that the release was probably about my age. I'll guess 75.
Okay, so the year was 1967.
Okay.
Okay. And so let me read this, okay? Because I don't think 1967 was necessarily when he released the first.
That was when he developed it for the Arkansas River project.
Yes, this is what led to the development. So this is right out of the HEC-6 manual.
Oh, cool.
The time sequencing method of scour and deposition calculations was developed at the Little Rock District of the Corps of Engineers in 1967 by Tony Thomas. It led to the development of HEC-6. The motivation for that effort was to confirm land acquisition requirements for Ozark Reservoir on the Arkansas River, recognizing potential future (50-year) sedimentation. And what really interests me in this is that how often do you work a career where you do a 50-year simulation and you have a chance to see how it turned out. Now, I'd love to ask Tony that, like, hey, this was 1967.
Yep.
We're now in 2023, so we're beyond that 50-year period. How did it turn out?
And he tells a great story on the podcast. This will be season 2 about how he actually developed that model. People didn't believe they thought computers were a fad back then. And so he had to kind of prove himself on his own time. And then we did ask him about, not many people have careers where they can look back on a 50-year simulation and say, how did it do? And we talked to him a little bit about that.
That's amazing, though, if you think about it. He was in 67. He wasn't just starting. He was writing a computer program to do sediment transport.
That's right.
That's incredible.
That's right. Just incredible guy.
More than 50 years ago. Yeah. All right,
Stanford, what do you got for us?
Okay, let me start. No, I'll go with this one. So we just put a riprap calculator in RAS. So speaking of the hydraulic design calculator, we added a riprap calculator. In the riprap calculator, which uses the Corps of Engineers process, if you switch from angular riprap to rounded rock, right? That's the only difference you make. The weight of the rock you need to provide the same protection increases. What percent does the weight of the rock increase if you just switch from angular riprap to rounded rock because it's pretty?
I'm going to say a multiplier of 1.4.
I'm going to say
40% larger.
Yeah, 40%.
I'm going to say 74.5%.
All right, those are great. Those are great. Well, so incidentally, the diameter increases by 30%. So you need a 30% larger diameter, but that's cubed.
Yeah.
And so the weight of the rock almost doubles. It's like 98%. That when I started working on the riprap tool, I underestimated. People really like rounded rock because it's pretty, but you actually need twice the rock in order to offer the same level of protection, according to the Corps of Engineers process.
What's the biggest rock you've ever spec'd out?
That's a great question.
I don't spec. I develop software.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm asking that because I had a project where I was doing riprap revetment for a bank opposite of a spillway. And so you can imagine the velocities and forces there. Oh, yeah. And we ended up putting in, I think our rock size will average about 7-foot diameter.
Oh, wow. So that's...
And we grouted some of it too on top of that.
So we're doing work on the Rio Coca in Ecuador, which I hope we'll have a podcast on. If you're not familiar with the waterfall collapse and the regressive erosion down there, it's a massive event. We did some physical modeling to see what kind of rock they would need to provide protection, and it was 2 meters, so it sounds like it's on the same order. Yeah, but that's outside of the range of anything the riprap calculator could do. We had to do physical modeling to get there.
Yeah,
well, Stan, that sounds like an interesting enough topic. Maybe we'll have to have you back on when you have some final results from that, and let's discuss that, because that sounds like an amazing project. It's an amazing team. It's a core team. It's an interagency team, and the Ecuadorian team is fantastic. But it's this morphological event of our generation. And what is it called again for those that maybe want to pop online and take a look at some stuff related to it?
So the San Rafael waterfall was the largest waterfall in Ecuador, and I say was because it's a 140-meter waterfall that had a piping failure because there was a lava dam that wasn't complete. And so the river dropped 140 feet or 140 meters. And now there's about 13 kilometers of regressive erosion, almost over 200 million tons of sediment. And it's kind of headed towards the dam that produces 30% of Ecuador's power.
Wow.
So it is
it's head cutting up to the dam.
It's head cutting towards the dam, and so the Ecuadorian government has brought the Corps of Engineers on to help. It's a big deal.
And what's the timeline in terms of when they're projecting that head cut will reach the dam?
Well, it hung up on a debris flow, which we're all very thankful for. But it's uncertain.
Gotcha. Wow, crazy. All right, well, I'll get into my question here. And instead of having two questions, because I think you guys each have two, I have a three-parter, but it's kind of all the same principle. So this kind of builds into one of the things that I would like to do one day, Stan, which is to have a HEC-RAS Jeopardy episode where we have you and Cam and Gary and Chris and actually do like a Jeopardy. And this would be kind of a similar type of format. So the topic for this three-part question is called defaults. So it's default settings within RAS.
I'll take defaults for 600, Ben.
Oh no.
So there's three default settings that I'm going to ask you about, and you are to name what the default setting is. So the first one is, if you create a 2D mesh in RASMapper, what is the default cell size?
I know.
Too big.
I know what
too
it
big.
Is. I know what it is.
Too big.
Can I go? I know what it is.
You can go.
Do you know what it is, Stanford?
I think so.
There's an asterisk next to the answer here.
It's 100 by 100 feet.
Correct.
That's right.
Yeah.
And technically just 100 by 100, right, Chris? Because if you're in metric, it'd be 100 by 100 meters. Right. So that's an important
is it 100 meters too if you do SI, or does
correct? It's just 100 by 100. So your first answer is correct.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The second default that I have for you is, what is the default computational interval? In an unsteady flow simulation.
Again, too high.
That one's changed. High. That's changed over the years.
Yeah, I'm looking at, just to clarify, I'm looking at version 6.1 right now.
Yeah, it hasn't changed since then.
I have a good story about this because I do a lot of technical support. People who've taken my class, they'll call, but then, through the blog and everything, the RAS Solution blog, people will come to me with an email, and sometimes they'll send their model and say, hey, my model's crashing right away. One of the number one causes when I get those emails is they didn't change the default time step. 100%. Yeah. And
when I teach classes, I say, when I'm trying to troubleshoot a model, whether it's 1D unsteady, 2D unsteady, or sediment transport, the first thing I do is I drop the time step by an order of magnitude, and like 30% of the time the model runs.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's still this way. I think it's changed, but for the longest time it was 1 hour was the default time.
It's a minute now.
It's a minute now.
Is it a minute now, Ben?
I think so. That's better. That's way better.
So we've tried to move people in that, because I don't know. I've never run a model where the time step's an hour. Sediment, sometimes if you have a low transport, but in the quasi unsteady, but any sort of hydraulic model, minute is actually often long.
So building off of that then, Stan, because we just had two, there's one more default coming, but we just had two default discussions. So we had cell size and time step. And for both of them, the first thing you said was too large, right? That was your answer, which is correct, but not specific enough to warrant credit. So if those are too large, why do you think those are still the default settings within RAS? Because obviously there's version updates, every 6 months, it seems like, and at any one of those version updates, they could update those default settings. So do you have any peek behind the curtain as to why that might be?
Well, no, but I can tell you why I wouldn't change them, because they're too large for your final model. But good modeling practice starts simple and gets more complex. Yeah. And so, 100 meters even is not too large for a big floodplain cell. And because RAS has subgrid bathymetry, if you don't know what that means, I think I have a video on it, that because RAS has subgrid bathymetry, you can get away with really big cell sizes in parts of the model you don't care that much about. And so like you always want to start coarse, and then you need a time step, but then you add complexity. And so I wouldn't want to start with a tiny cell and then try to make it coarser. That's harder. And so we want you to start coarse and then get finer where you need it, and make and change your time step to fit that. But you have to know that. You have to know that we're giving you a starting point. We're not giving you the optimal cell size.
Yeah. Right. Good. So the last part of this default question is, when you create an SA2D area connection inside of a 2D area, there is a default weir coefficient that's associated with that SA2D area connection. What is the well, if Stan knows what it is, Chris, what is the oh, you don't? Okay.
Yeah, it's like it depends on SI or US customary. Is it 3.2?
This is a US customary model. So
is it 3.2?
3.2 is Stan's guess.
I'm going to guess 2.0.
Okay. So I'm in the middle. It's actually 3.0.
Okay.
Default weir coefficient. All right. So very close to
I was thinking lateral structure.
You were thinking lateral, because lateral, the default is
it's lower. Yeah.
It used to be 2, and you have to bring it below 1.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. So yeah, it's a little fun little category. You guys did pretty well.
Yeah, very good. All right, I got a question for you guys. All
Okay.
right. So so inside of HEC-RAS, sediment transport, there's a place where you can put in your gradations, right?
Yes.
That's
the size of the different materials, the size of the different sediment classes.
Yeah, and it's broken up into many categories. I don't know the exact number, like 24 or something like that. 20. Okay. What is the largest diameter of sediment represented on the standard grain classification scale in HEC-RAS? And Stanford, if you don't know this, I'm going to be very disappointed. Ben, you could maybe take a guess, but we were talking about large particle sizes just a minute ago.
Yeah.
So
can you repeat the question, Chris?
What is the largest diameter of sediment represented on the standard grain classification scale in HEC-RAS?
Is it in SI or English that it's listed?
It's in millimeters.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you might want to report it in meters.
Yeah, I was going to say. Can multiply everything by 100.
Yeah, right.
I will go ahead and guess 1 meter is the
1,000 millimeters. What do you think,
So
Stanford?
I just taught a class in this, and last week I taught a class and I told them I don't have these grain classes memorized. What I know is 0.063 E is the silt sand boundary. 0.044 microns is the silt clay boundary. 2 millimeters is the sand gravel boundary, and then bigger than your fist is a cobble and bigger than your head is a boulder. And so that's my classification system. But it's a log-based. It's a log-based 2 scale. And so every size, the bottom threshold of every size is double the bottom. So it goes 1 millimeter to 2 millimeters, 2 millimeters to 4 millimeters, 4 millimeters to 8 millimeters. And I have to say that actually the mixing algorithms start to break down when you get over a meter. And so I never use those grain classes. The boulder grain classes I think the top boulder grain class is like 1 meter and change to 2 meters and change. So whatever the geometric mean of the log base 2, 1 meter and 2 meter is.
You're on to it. Yeah, the largest in it is 2,048 millimeters, so 2.048 meters.
But that's the upper bound. The actual representative grain size would be the geometric mean.
Right, between 1024 and 2048. Yeah,
That's
whatever the geometric mean is there. Yeah. Cool. All right, Stanford, what's your
last
second?
one?
Okay, this one's easier. How many sediment transport functions are there in HEC-RAS, and combined transport functions count? So anything in the drop-down menu.
Okay. I was going to ask you to name all of them, and so I took a peek at this yesterday.
You did, yeah.
But I didn't count them. So I think it's Ben. Do you want to give a guess, and then I'll tell you what I think?
I would look silly if I guessed, Chris. I'm gonna let you guess, and then let that inform mine.
I think it's 7, but that might be plus or minus 1.
Yeah,
I'll take 6.
It was 7, but we added a couple, and then we added 3 for 2D, and so we're up to 11. But then you can go and modify them, and like you can add the Wong-Parker correction to Meyer-Pierre-Mueller. So like I would have accepted a number higher than 11, but we are up to 11, which actually is probably too many because you actually have to know a lot to make that choice. One of the reasons why we're trying to do interviews with as many of the developers or people we know, people who knew the developers, because we'd really like to make a video on each one of those so that can help you choose.
Cool. Wow, that's great. I didn't know that there were separate ones for 2D. Were they developed specifically for 2D sediment transport? Or they just work better?
They work. So for there are 2 versions of Van Ryn, and then Wei-Ming Wu. Alex Sanchez developed the 2D features, and Alex Sanchez is a student of Wei-Ming Wu, and so we use a lot of Wei-Ming's ideas and like his whole framework. The 2D sediment really comes out of the Wei-Ming Wu school, and so that transport function was developed for when I do 2D. My opening offer is Wu.
Hey, speaking of Van Ryn, did you know he was my professor in grad school?
I did know that. That's fantastic.
So some of the sediment, some of the stable channel stuff I have in there, I peppered a little Van Ryn in there just because I just learned it in graduate school. So anyway,
Well,
he's great. He has a lot of good stuff.
I think I was the big loser in that event. I think we'll crown Stan as the winner for that segment. I think that was
all right,
a clear scoring. So yeah, let's, I guess, move into the last segment of the podcast today. So we talked a little bit about Stan, your background. We talked about the RSM podcast. We did some fun HEC-RAS trivia. I'm just going to turn it over to you at this point to talk a little bit about sediment modeling, and we can kind of steer this conversation where you want it to go. But yeah, so I'll turn it over to you. Chris, do you have an opening salvo of questions for Stan regarding that?
I think it's great. Yeah, just tell us, one thing I really like to ask you, so you can weave this in however you like, Stanford, is somebody who's going to pick up sediment transport modeling for the first time, what should they be aware of? But yeah, tell us all about sediment as where it's been,
Well, there are really two directions that people come to sediment transport modeling from. Either they're hydraulic modelers who know a tool, RAS or a tool like RAS for hydraulics, and then someone asks them to add sediment. Or they're geomorphologists who want to get more quantitative about their geomorphology, and so then they come to a hydraulic model. And those are actually two very different approaches, because the geomorphologist understands the complexity of the system, but maybe not the physics of the hydraulics. And that's a big lift for them. But the hydraulic modeler is not really prepared for the uncertainty that comes with adding sediment. A lot of people think, oh, I have a RAS model. Surely it'll cost me another 10% of my budget to just add sediment. And that's that's not how that works. Basically, sediment is varsity modeling. It's advanced modeling. You need to. But one of the things I like to say is that hydraulic sediment modeling is actually a lot more like groundwater or hydrology than hydraulics. In hydraulics, we have really beautiful equations that are self-correcting, and there's only one uncertainty parameter, really, the n value. Obviously, there are other things, there's turbulence and stuff like that, but we take most of our uncertainty and put it into this linear term called the Manning's N. And so we're used to having very constrained uncertainty in hydraulic models. In one of the podcasts, Chris Nygaard actually said that they sometimes use their hydraulic models to interrogate their data. They actually trust their hydraulic results more than their data sometimes. Or if they're because hydraulic modeling is so constrained that sometimes there's a conversation between the hydraulics and the input data. Sediment transport is more like hydrology and groundwater in that there are so many free parameters that you really have to constrain your conceptual space. You can't just kind of change all of your parameters until you match them. Well, first of all, you have to calibrate. One of the things Tony Thomas says is that if you don't calibrate a sediment transport model, you don't get to call it a model. You can call it a computational experiment, which is sometimes still valuable, but it's not a model of because our equations are uncertain and our data have so much spread to them. It's not a model of reality until you've compared it to reality. And so calibration is usually half my scope, getting my model calibrate, and then the actual running the alternatives is not trivial, but it's a very small portion of what you're going to do once you kind of develop the intuition about the system during your calibration. The other thing that's different about sediment transport modeling is that you're not necessarily giving absolute answers. You're giving relative answers. And so, I'm not going to tell you that this river is going to deposit 3 feet in 50 years. What I'll tell you is that this river is going to deposit 3 feet more than if we didn't, put in the project in 50 years, plus or minus 1 foot. And those are the kinds of things, you're going to give. Sometimes the results of sediment modeling is more qualitative, is that, this alternative is going to cause the system to deposit more or less. And those are the sorts of insights that sediment modeling can give. Sediment modeling isn't useless. Some people have just kind of given up on it and saying, it's so uncertain, we can't get any answers from it. Well, you can't get a result to 3 sig figs, but you can understand if I make this management choice, is it likely, depending on future hydrology, is it likely to cause more or less deposition? Is it likely to cause more or less erosion? Is it likely to switch me from a depositional to an erosional regime? And those are the sorts of things that can be really helpful for managers. And so I think that those are the first 2 things. Is that first, calibration is essential. If someone calls me and wants me to do a sediment transport model, my first question is,
do you have calibration data?
What's your calibration data?
Yeah.
And if they don't have calibration data, I might find myself really busy. I can't recommend any contractors, but I might suggest there are lots of qualified contractors who might be happy to take on this work. I'm being facetious there, obviously, but whenever I take on a project, I'm always in my head, I have this running line of probability of success from the first conversation. What's the probability, not that I'll be able to show something or tell a story, but that I'm actually going to provide real value to the customer. That I'm actually going to, what do I sell? I sell reductions in risk. That's what I sell. That's the widget I sell. I sell, incremental reductions of risk. And so I'm always kind of calculating, am I going to be able to reduce the client's risk? And if they come in and say, yeah, we have some sediment load data, and we have repeated cross sections, and we have concentrations downstream, I think, oh, those are points of reality that I can compare my model to. My probability that I'm going to reduce their risk increases. But if they come in and say, no, we have a hydraulic model that hasn't been calibrated, but we want you to tell us what's going to happen in the future, I might tell them to, you don't have enough data for a sediment model. You want to use some of the hydraulic design tools in order to, make less of investment and get the same level of risk reduction.
Wow. So let's get into a little bit about what's available in RAS. The first version of sediment transport was 1D quasi and steady, which is basically running a series of steady flow runs. And I don't know, something like 6-7 years ago, you had 1D unsteady come out, right?
That's right. And
then just recently, 2D unsteady sediment transport. So tell us a little bit about the differences between those. How would you decide between those 3?
That's a great question. So quasi and steady, you've probably seen the buttons on RAS, because if you're an advanced RAS user or any kind of RAS user, you've probably done steady and unsteady, and you notice they're separated by a button. And that's the quasi and steady button that's almost exclusively for sediment. And the idea there is that, when we model sediment in RAS, we're not just kind of routing concentration through the model, we're actually changing the cross section every time step. And so now you have 2 free boundary conditions. You're not only computing the difference in the water surface, you're computing the change in the bed. And so if you've ever run unsteady hydraulics and had trouble getting that stable, well, imagine now that you're not just changing the surface, you're also changing the bed. And so what quasi unsteady does is it runs a series of steady flows, changes the hydraulics on with a more stable hydrodynamic model, and then changes the bed. And so quasi unsteady is a much more stable way to do sediment. But it doesn't conserve volume of water. It conserves volume of sediment, but it doesn't conserve volume of water. So if storage is a major part of your system, if you're trying to operate a reservoir, or if you've got a big floodplain storage abstraction or something like that, there are cheats. We just taught this class, John Shelley, he taught all the cheats. But if you've got an attenuating hydrograph, down 100 miles of river, if anything's kind of fundamentally unsteady about your hydraulics, you kind of have to fake it in quasi unsteady, and particularly reservoirs or reservoir flushing, it just doesn't work. And so if you go to particularly reservoir models, I mainly use unsteady 1D for reservoir models. The null hypothesis should be quasi unsteady, because you're gonna have a much better time. But if you have to operate your reservoir, and one of the cool things is that we've added sediment rules to the operational rules in RAS. And so if you're doing like a reservoir flushing model, you can code up your rules in like maximum concentrations downstream and stuff like that. Now you can leverage lateral structures. You can send sediment over your lateral structures. You can leverage all the cool features in unsteady with sediment, but it's going to come at a stability cost. But fortunately, in reservoirs, how stable are reservoirs? Reservoirs tend to be really stable. And so you can get away with that often in reservoirs, or in kind of large rivers that don't change very quickly. But that's all 1D.
Yeah.
And I like to say that 1D sediment is really just 1D sediment and RAS is really just a sophisticated sediment budget. We're just kind of looking at the inputs and the outputs and changing the storage. It's a sophisticated sediment budget. 2D is actually like a sediment model where you're actually looking at the momentum of the particles and you're looking at advection and diffusion and routing things in a sophisticated way. And it comes really at a computational cost. The technology in 2D is actually a lot better because when Alex started developing that model, his task was to, do the best he could with the current science. When I started developing 1D almost 20 years ago, it was to replicate a model that was already 20 years old. And so, if you can do 2D, you want to. And we've been doing more of this like quasi 2D modeling where you build a mesh that has one channel cell and one overbank cell on either side. But the runtimes. And the thing about sediment is that you often want to run sediment for 50 years. And so that's where 2D just isn't there yet. And so 1D sediment is a reach scale, decadal scale model. You don't want to look at what's happening at a cross section. You don't want to look at what's happening at an event. But in 50 years, we'll actually tell you a good story. 2D is for events and bends and particularly floodplain processes. If you want to simulate floodplain processes, you want to be in 2D.
So one of the things that I remember always, informing people of is, because a lot of folks, when they hear sediment transport modeling, they think channel forming models where you're going to build a model and then run it, and it's going to tell you what the river channel is going to look like in 50 years. And obviously with 1D, that wasn't what the purpose of that was. How close is the 2D sediment transport engine to a channel forming model? Is it getting closer to that, or is it still like there's still a disconnect between those two things? You need to make sure that people that are using them understand that caveat.
Yeah, the biggest issue with like a full morphodynamic model is widening, right? Widening is a really difficult process. Actually, in 1D, we have a geotechnical bank widening model called BSTEM that the HEC-RAS developed. We developed that with Eddie Langdon and Andrew Simon. 2D doesn't have a geotechnical model of widening. It does have some like stable slope heuristics in it. And so you can get some widening, but it's a mobile bed sediment transport model, which means it's going to do a lot better in the vertical than it's going to do in the horizontal. And so it's not actually going to develop the future channel. It's going to tell you, if the future channel is too small or too big.
Gotcha. Okay.
Very, very interesting. So another thing that you've worked on recently and has come out recently is mud and debris flow.
That's right.
And I've had a lot of fun looking into that and playing around with it lately. What are your thoughts on mud and debris flow? Where's it going? Are people using it yet?
Yeah, it's getting a lot. This hit the ground with the demand. Obviously, I'm out here in California in Davis, and even up where you are, post-wildfire is a big deal. And one of the things that about the time this comes out, the episode of the podcast will be freshest will be a conversation with Dr. Richard Iverson, who is probably the expert in mud and debris flows for the USGS. And he has a much more sophisticated tool than we have in RAS that actually looks at, and we talk a lot about that, about like the how the pore water pressure increases inside and it dilates, and there's lots of cool processes going on in there. But a lot of emergency managers just need to do better than clear water flow. And what we call, water is what we famously call a Newtonian fluid. I have lots of talks on this in YouTube if you want to go. We won't go deep into it, but the essence is that falls down. Like just doing clear water Newtonian hydraulics doesn't work for post wildfire where you're carrying 30, 35, 40, 65% solids. The physics of the material changes as the solid interactions increase, and so you have to account for that. And so we have these non-Newtonian rheological approaches in in RAS that are just getting widely used. They're in 1D and 2D, but the truth is that if you're in a non-Newtonian situation, 2D, first of all, it's fast. It's not a 50-year-ish thing. So the runtimes are pretty quick. And you really want 2D because you're often on an alluvial plain or something like that. We have a paper on this. It's also getting used a lot for mine-tailing dam failure analysis and the Broom-Hilo event that happened down in Brazil.
How do you get useful calibration data for mud and debris flow models? Because I imagine collecting that data is pretty risky. But what kind of data sources did you have to calibrate those models?
Well, these events are horrific, obviously. But the nice thing about these events, if you could use that word, is they certainly leave a mark. And so there's, calibration, in retrospect is actually pretty easy because the mud plane is very clear. Like you can actually go and trace the mud plane on Google Earth, right? But they leave scars on the trees. They leave, it's very clear where that event has been. And so calibrating to a historic event is actually pretty easy. Predicting a future event is very hard because, and so my colleague, Jay Pack, who is in charge of sediment transport in HMS, has added some post-wildfire sediment yield models in HMS. So the idea is you could use that tool, come up with a concentration and put it into RAS and run RAS. But those concentrations they're regression equations based on where you're from. And that's going to be very variable. And then you need at least 2 non-Newtonian parameters. And so what we're kind of doing now is really trying to bring as much of that parametric data together as we can to help people make those choices in RAS.
Because there's so much uncertainty, do you have to run kind of unique sensitivity analysis for a mud and debris model differently than what you would do for a hydraulic model? Do you vary, for instance, in a hydraulic model, usually your sensitivity analysis is around Mannings. Yeah. Are there other parameters that you would focus that sensitivity analysis on for a mud and debris flow model?
Well, it's funny you use the word unique because as a sediment transport modeler, I always have at least 3 parameters that I need to do sensitivity analysis on. But for a hydraulic modeler, yeah, it's new. You're used to just doing sensitivity on Mannings-N, but now you need to do sensitivity on the volumetric concentration. What's the mass of solids? And then also on how that volumetric concentration turns into what we call a yield stress and the viscosity of the fluid, because the viscosity of the mixture is going to change based on that material, and those numbers can actually vary by orders of magnitude.
Interesting. And is there no relation to the percentage of the fluid that's solids and what the viscosity is? Like, are those not dependent?
There is, and Pierre Julien has some exponential equations in his famous textbook, and he did a lot of work with Jim O'Brien on this. And so there are equations that will turn concentration into viscosity, but then you still have to parameterize those equations. They're power laws, and so there are some default factors that work within reasonable ranges. But once you start to get outside of the range, they start to diverge, and even then, these materials do have it can vary substantially for the same concentration depending on the clay content or anything like that. And so you do have to provide. One of the things I like to say is that you should never provide one answer in sediment transport. You should always provide a band of reasonable solutions.
Well, Stanford, I can't believe how the time has flown by here. We've been talking over an hour and I've enjoyed every minute of it. I want to give you an opportunity to plug your YouTube site, your website, your podcast. Before that, Ben, why don't you read out our sponsorship, and then we'll jump into that.
Yeah, that sounds great. Again, really, I've enjoyed the conversation, Stan. We're also thankful to our sponsor for this episode, which is our firm, Kleinschmidt Associates. Kleinschmidt is known throughout the industry as a firm that provides practical solutions to complex problems affecting energy, water, and the environment. You can learn more at kleinschmidtgroup.com. Thanks again, Kleinschmidt, for sponsoring today's episode. And yeah, Stan, go ahead and plug all the content that you're putting out there and where people can find you.
Well, the first thing that people should know is we have all of the RAS documentation and helps online now. And so if you're anywhere in RAS and are wondering what you should be doing, you can press function F1 and it's context specific. We'll bring you to the web page that is about that. And one of the things that we're doing on those web pages is we are embedding the videos right in those web pages.
Oh,
and so
nice.
A lot of times if you press control F1, we'll take you not only to like the user manual, but to a video that shows you how to do it. But this is one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about. If I want to learn a new piece of software, I don't read manuals. And please read the manual, but I don't. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do is I'm trying to generate a fair bit of, online web video content, because that's how I learn software. So there's actually two YouTube channels. There's a HEC-RAS channel where we're posting classes, long form stuff. So like I'm actually setting up videos and taking videos of my colleagues teaching classes. We have 2 classes up there. I'm working through the footage from 3 others. And so we're just going to have classes up there that, people can work through, and we're trying to put some of the workshop materials up there. But then I actually have at Stanford Gibson on YouTube or something like that. We call it the Sediment Transport Station, but I do lots of stuff on there. I'll sometimes just put shorts of like RAS tips and tricks, things that I'm like, this is really cool. It's in RAS. I don't think people know about this. And so I'll put up a 3-minute video on like how to wrap up RAS files to send them to your friend. And so those are some places you can go to not only kind of build morphological intuition, but also learn some RAS tips. And then we also have videos on there. One of the things we're doing with the podcast is we're taking excerpts from the podcast and turning them into, produced videos, with footage. We have one that's cool with Joanna Curran, and she did some lab work. And so we have her talking, and her laboratory models are there while she's describing them. Molly Wood is describing sampling, and she has, sonar, the samplers going through the system. And so anything that would be visual or, more technical so that you would want some visuals, we're trying to make videos of them as well.
That's great. Yeah. So I always tell people, if you Google HEC, add USACE after that, or just Google HEC-RAS, and that'll take you to the HEC web page. If you just do HEC, it takes you someplace in Paris, which is different. And Google Stanford Gibson. That'll take you to his YouTube page, and you'll find all the content, including this awesome podcast that you're doing. And Richard Iverson's the next up. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm going to get some yard work done listening to you and Richard Iverson. And Stanford, this has been great. I really appreciate you coming on, sharing your knowledge and expertise with everybody. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks, guys. Great talking with you.
All right.
Awesome. Thanks again, Stan. Appreciate the time. This has been Full Momentum, an HEC-RAS podcast. Until next time.